dice jail. Welcome to episode 3 of JunkDrawer Studios. Today we're making a few different dice jails. What is a dice jail? Well, if you clicked on this video, you probably already know, but let me explain for those who don't. Hi Mom, thanks for watching. So yeah, it's just a silly little, slightly superstitious tradition in Dungeons & Dragons. Really, it's just kind of a funny, nerdy, goofy thing. But if you're like me who has rolled multiple nat ones in a row before, it can also be extremely cathartic. The approaches range from something you might expect, like a little dungeon-y cave kind of thing, to something a little bit more wacky, like a nasty, dirty dumpster. So let's jump in and see how I made those. Here is the concept for dice jail number 1. If you've ever thought about making a dice jail or looked them up online, this is probably the most typical approach that you'll see. It's just a miniature cage / jail cell, I guess. And I did stick to this concept pretty closely. I didn't do the domed roof, I did a slightly different approach there in the final product, but overall it's pretty similar to what I ended up with in the end. Next, for dice jail number 2, I wanted to do something a little spooky. I went with a tombstone and a little divot of dirt in front of it where the dice will sit. Does this make sense for a dice jail? I don't know, but I wanted to do something a little spooky, and this seemed like a fun approach. I also added a silly little epitaph on the tombstone itself. I did end up going with a slightly different one, so you will have to stick around to see what it ended up saying in the final piece. Dice jail number 3 was my approach of doing something that would be appropriate for a game like Necromunda or maybe Warhammer. Really any game that is in an industrial setting, whether it's an RPG or a war game. I should say I don't actually know if any other games use the idea of dice jail other than Dungeons & Dragons, but it was fun to make, so I did it. And finally, for the 4th concept, I just went with a dumpster. Because if you roll a nat 1, those dice are trash. This could go with any game that is in a modern or post-apocalyptic setting, but I also kind of feel like it would go really well with any type of setting because it's just kind of a jokey dice jail to begin with. Here are the final 4 concepts. Now let's get them built. Let's build some dice jails. I'm starting with the classic cage. I'm using this random piece of plastic to cut out a circle out of some XPS foam with a snap blade. I love using XPS foam for anything that's rocky or stony. It just lends itself so well to being carved into with a sharp blade. Here I'm cutting it into a circle, and I think I did a pretty good job. I don't have a fancy hot wire cutter, but I'm okay with it not being absolutely perfect. Here I'm also gonna cut it in half with that same blade. This is more difficult without a hot wire cutter. But again, I think I managed all right. Please, please, please be careful if you're doing this. Take your time and let the blade do the work. And yeah, there's my cut job. I wanted the inner circle to be smaller, so here I am just roughly drawing an inner circle and hacking the foam away just like I did the first time. And there you go. Now we have a little platform, which will eventually be turned into stone for the dice to sit on. I had these extra little pre-cut bits of popsicle sticks from an old project that felt like a good size. I lined them up on this foam disc because I wanted to make some little indents where they would be slotted in. It's a little hard to explain, but you'll see what I mean in a second. I basically just needed little grooves for these to slide into. I used this Japanese wood carving tool to help make these slots, and they're a little rough, but they definitely did the job. So as you can see, this is kind of what I'm picturing. This dice jail is unique from the other ones because it's a cage, but I need it to be able to be removed from the bottom stone part, just to be able to put the dice back and forth. So here you can see I'm gluing those wooden sticks to a ring of chipboard, just so that it's tight enough that it stays on the foam, but can be pulled on and off. You can't tell I'm completely winging this, can you? I took some thin strips of EVA foam with some super glue and just glued them around the sticks. This was really finicky, but I wanted to add both some visual interest and some structural stability with this. I took another piece of chipboard, did a really cool transition, and glued the base of the stone structure onto that so that the wooden sticks would have a stopping point. See how they're sitting on the platform. It is a little angled though, and I would love to say that I did this on purpose, but I didn't. But what I did do was use it to my advantage. You can see here I'm gluing another thin piece of chipboard just to even out the level of the sticks. Yes, I could have shortened all the other sticks, but that would have taken a lot longer. And also, this allows it so that it only fits one way. This was kind of important since I spaced out all these sticks by hand and it would be kind of tricky to figure out what way it fit. Now, I just look for the short stick. As I was yapping about that, you probably saw I added little bits of extra wood on the inside of some of the foam, as well as these extra little foam bits on top, again, to add more structural stability and visual interest. Here I'm taking another piece of foam and using a very sophisticated technique of cutting out a circle from another circle. And I'm using this as sort of a ring on the top to hold this cross-stitching mesh. This I just thought was, another little jail-esque looking detail that I could add on top. I mentioned this when I did the concept art, but I was originally going to have this be domed at the top. I, to be honest, kind of just thought that was too complicated and went with the grading instead. Here I'm just drawing out the rough stone pattern. If you watched my previous video where I created the lighthouse dice tower, you probably remember I got pretty jazzed about doing this step. It's just really satisfying to carve into this foam with a pencil. I'm just drawing them out, not super worried about them being perfect. This is sort of a fantasy, medieval, handmade dungeon anyway. Don't forget to do the sides as well. This really sells the realism. Once you've done that, go over it one more time and you'll get this type of a result. You've really defined the stone and added a lot of detail just with that part alone. But now for even more detail, I went in with a little snap blade and just beveled some of the edges, carved into some of it. You could take this really far and make it look really chipped and gnarly and cracked, whatever your project calls for. Finally, with a trusty ball of tinfoil, add a little bit more rock or stone texture. As you can see, you should wait for the glue to dry before doing this because I accidentally popped the top layer off, but that's okay, I glued it back together. And as a last step for the build of this dice jail, I glued on some rivets. I wasn't really happy with how this was coming out at this point, I gotta tell you, but please stay tuned for the painting phase because that was when things really turned around. Anyway, I added some bigger chunky rivets and some small glass beads, and this was the final result. Moving on to the tombstone. I was so excited to do this one. I've always wanted to make tombstones as like scatter terrain. It just felt like it would be fun to do. And I was not wrong. I had a lot of fun with this one. Here I am carving into the XPS foam. I just mentioned it in the last build, but if I had a hot wire cutter, this would be easier. But I kind of like the handmade look, I think it adds a certain charm. So I cut out the rough shape and then, added some bevels with that little snap blade, added some little chips, added some texture with the tinfoil, a lot like the steps of the previous build. This is where you get all that good detail in. I then went in with a pencil and tried this sort of stone texturing technique that I saw in a different video. I'll link it here if I can remember where I got it from. And I like it. I think it's cool. It kind of looks like marble, I guess, or like veins of rock. I'm not really sure, but if anything, it just adds a variety of texture. Here, I numbered out the letters so I could make sure that they were centered. This is a handy little trick. However, I very quickly messed this up, which you can see here. The T and the I are very far apart from each other. I don't know why I did that. It kind of looks ridiculous. I think I saved it in the end, but yeah, I took all this time to count out the letters and I kind of messed it up, but oh well. And yes, the irony is not lost on me that I am literally writing critical failure when I kind of failed at writing this out. I also failed filming it because this is what a lot of the shots looked like. But in the end, I'm happy with how it looks. I think it maybe looks like some old-timey hand-chiseled tombstone, and that's what I was going for. Oh, I added a little D20 detail too. So there she is. I'm happy with this. I think critical failure was better than here lies nat 1, which is what I wrote in the concept art. Now on to making the base look a little bit better. I started with this just kind of beveled foam board, and then I added handy dandy Sculptamold. This is a plaster modeling compound. It's really sticky, it dries really hard. I just smushed it over everything, stuck the tombstone in. I even stick the dice in temporarily just to make the imprint. While that was kind of setting up, I pushed some rocks in. Again, this stuff is really sticky the way it cures, so you don't really have to use glue. It kind of just all sticks together once it dries. I added a little bit of rock and ballast to add a little bit more ground texture. Here I'm just painting on some PVA glue and water and sprinkling on all that beautiful rock texture. This is the final result. Moving on to the sci-fi build, I guess you could call it. I took an old medicine bottle, this little casing that used to have a tea light candle in it, some foam boards, some toy pipes that you can buy on Amazon. A lot of people use this. And I just got the basic shape going. I then collected a ton of different materials to make this kind of textury sci-fi base. Some cables, some zip ties, this random thing I had glued to a piece of foam, bread tabs. Oh my gosh, save these if you eat bread. Those are awesome. A little bit of grating. Ooh, and baking soda. This comes into play in a moment. First, I'm just gluing the base up, putting a bunch of super glue, and then you'll see me starting to sprinkle on some baking soda. If you don't already know this trick, baking soda works as an accelerant, I guess. I don't really know the science behind it. But it helps accelerate super glue, so it cures really, really fast. The only downside is it creates this kind of crusty look, but it works perfectly when you're making something that's going to be rusty anyway. It actually adds so much interesting texture, so while I don't use it every single time I use super glue, I definitely use it every time I'm doing something rusty, because not only does it make it easier to work with, but it makes this cool looking rusty effect. Once everything's dry, just use a dry brush and you can dust away all of the extra baking soda. Finally, I took some glue, bulked out the inside with some tinfoil, and put some air dry clay, which I smoothed out with some wet fingers to create the slime that would be on the inside. Moving on to the fourth and final dice jail, the dumpster. I'm cutting out some pieces of chipboard to roughly fit, the shape of the dice. And some of the walls I'm gonna cut at an angle because you know how dumpsters have like a shorter front usually. I don't know if I made that up, but it looks aesthetically nice to me. No idea what I'm doing in this clip. I just kind of wanted to make sure the dice fit, but that obviously was a pointless test. I'm now gluing the sides together with some hot glue, making sure to not have too much glue seeping out of the outside, and just reinforcing it on the inside. I glued on some panels to mimic dumpster references on the front. On the sides, I took some corrugated scrap cardboard and glued them on the side to add a little bit more visual interest. I then capped off the top with some more corrugated paper. The dumpster wouldn't be closed because the dice needs to go inside, but I still made a lid to kind of perch on. No idea what these plastic pieces are, but I thought they would make good wheels. So I glued them on, and yeah, they made good wheels. That's the dumpster built. Oh, wait, I do have to add one more thing. The trash. The lid first, which I put a little piece of cardboard on to make sure it didn't slide off. Okay, now the trash. I bulked it out with some tinfoil, just like I did with the tank, made sure that there was a little imprint for the dice, and then I've been collecting this little bowl of literal trash since I've started this hobby, and this was its time to shine. So I took actual pieces of trash and glued them in to the dumpster just to create a variety of textures. And yeah, I think it looks awesome. So keep your scraps, even if you think they're too small to use. This was the perfect use for them. The painting phase. Grab some black paint and Mod Podge soup, as I like to call it, and just slather it over everything. Most crafters in this space know the drill. This locks everything in and acts as a great primer. Then grab a bunch of colors. These are some of the colors I used. I definitely call them out if there's anything really specific, but basically it's just a bunch of cheap craft paints. I started with some gray on the stone, as well as the jail part of this first dice jail. I figured it would act as a good primer for metal color that's coming next, and the beigey stone color that I'm applying here to the stone. Ooh, this part is really exciting. I had this black sequin metallic cheap craft paint, and I'd never used it before, but I quickly realized that this looked exactly like a greasy, gross, black raw iron, and that's exactly what I was hoping for. I truly couldn't be thrilled, and I'm probably going to start using this a lot more. You can't really tell on camera, but man, this stuff is fantastic. It comes in white too. I have never used this before, but I'm definitely going to in a future project. Finally, after some quick and kind of intentionally rough dry brushing of some metallic and some gray, I finally made a quick wash with some black acrylic ink and water. Also, pro tip, get yourself one of these bottles. It's so useful to always have clean water at your station. I'll link to it on screen. And this is what it looked like washed. I also grabbed some Agrax Earthshade from Citadel. I know this is very blasphemous, but I watered it down a little bit and slapped it all over the stone. I really wanted the stone to be warmer than the metallic cage, just so that they would have a lot of differentiation between the two. I also wiped some off with a damp cloth, and even though it kind of looks like teeth, I like it. Moving on to the tombstone. Black Mod Podge, of course, to start. I put a little too much on, so here I am scraping some of it off. Once that dries, base coat of gray on the tombstone. Make sure you cover everything. I also did a second coat off camera. Got some brown and some green onto the dirt to add a little natural earth texture. I then immediately went in with some dry brush of a lighter gray. Gosh, this really makes everything sing and grabs those edges so nicely. I did dry brushing to the rocks that I had embedded in the ground as well. I cleaned up the dirt part afterwards. Went in with a second dry brush of an even brighter white gray, and yeah, I love this. I added a wash to everything. A lot of the footage ended up looking like this, so apologies, but it came out pretty good. I was hoping it would seep into the letters a little bit more, but once it dried, it was hard to see. So here I just went in with some actual black paint to make the letters really stand out. Moving on to the sci-fi slime tank thing. I guess industrial is a better word. Slapped that black Mod Podge over everything, started with some gray. I feel like there's a trend happening here. And then went in with some additional colors. This is really where you have to trust the process. After this first coat, it looks a little janky, but it looks better in the end. I added some blue-gray to the ground, and then for my favorite part, rust. Yeah, I love rust. I only have 2 videos on this channel, well, 3 including this one, and it's already kind of become things that people have commented about, that I'm kind of becoming known for. Not saying that I'm like the best ever at this, just that I'm becoming known for loving to do rust. So I added a bunch of rust. I added this green color to the slime. Spoiler alert, the slime, I went through a journey with that. I wasn't really happy with the first coat of paint, but it got there in the end. Then I'm just adding some other little pops of color. The red, again, trust the process. This looks better after a second coat. I did some dry brushing on the edges and on the little details on the ground, hoping it would really pop, and it did. I think that the ground part looks awesome. Some of the dry brushing was a little heavy-handed. I knocked that back eventually. Added some yellow to this cable, again, for a pop of color. And yeah, so far it's coming out pretty good. I'm trying to add a little bit more detail to kind of bring it all together. I like where this ends up, but it took a while. And anyway, there's nothing that more rust can't fix, right? So I added some bright orange rust. I like to make it drippy. I add a little bit of water, kind of just stick to edges, places where water would be dripping or piling up. I added more where the dark rust already was, and yeah, I'm stoked with how this came out. Added some more black wash. This was really looking heavy, so I did end up watering it down a little bit. It was a little grimy, but this is kind of a grimy dice gel, so, you know, it's fine. I whipped some of it away with paper towel, and in the end, it does dry a little bit lighter than this, so it's okay. I tried to add this Army Painter slime color to this. Like I said, I went on a whole journey with this slime, and I still wasn't really thrilled with it, even after a couple coats, but it was getting there. Now to the dumpster. Added that black paint and Mod Podge to everything. I went pretty heavy-handed on the inside of the dumpster just to seal everything up. I then started mixing the paint color right on the outside of the dumpster. I don't know why I did this. Don't do this. But I was happy with this paint color in the end. That is until it dried like a completely different color that you can see here. I mean, I like it, the dark blue, but it was nothing like it looked like wet. I thought that was very strange. I added a little bit of paint to the inside and then finally rusted up this bad boy as well. And I know I say it all the time, but I love how this rust looks. I dry brushed all the edges with some light blue. I need to work on my dry brushing. I don't really know what colors to use. I think I end up going a little too light, a little too dusty. It does look great, but maybe I'll try a darker color next time. Finally, I'm adding a little bit metallic. I think this helps a lot make it look scratched up and not just totally rusted out. I added some select color to the inside of the dumpster just so that it would look like there were individual things in here. I ended up knocking it back a little bit with a wash, but I like having that pop of color. Speaking of pop of color, went in with the bright orange parts of the rust, and this is where it really starts to come to life. I feel like I have already talked about this way too much, so watch my previous videos if you want to hear me talk more about rust. For now, just enjoy the final product. Finally, like I said, I went in with that black acrylic wash, and it did grime it up a lot, but I think that works because it is a dumpster after all. And with that, the painting is done. First ice tower didn't really have any final details, but this one sure did. And fun fact, this awful looking Elmer's glue is just what happens when it's been sitting in a drawer for 4 or 5 years, apparently. I applied some glue that I hope works, and then I applied some static grass along with some green and colorful flocking. I'm not very good at static grass, so I didn't show a lot of it on the footage, but I think the end result looks okay. So yeah, I added some flowers. I don't know why I decided to make this spooky scene so cheery, but I do like how the flowers looked, so I couldn't help myself. I then took some Vallejo pigments and pigment binder. This stuff is awesome for making dirt. I'm a big proponent for not needing fancy stuff, but this is one of those exceptions. It works really well. You can use like pastels to make kind of dirt effects, but this, when it dries, looks so much like real dusty, dry dirt / mud. It's kind of unbelievable. So I just put a little bit here and there on this piece, and when it dries, you'll see what I mean. It's unbelievable. For the sci-fi industrial piece, I decided to add some water texture to the tank, which is what is currently drying in this shot. I'm also adding some hazard stripes with an acrylic paint marker. And honestly, for freehanding these, I am really happy with how these came out. Just these little details that really make everything pop. Speaking of, as a final step, I added some cool little hazardous decals. I also added some cool graffiti to the dumpster, which I love to do. I don't know why I'm writing crispy, but it just felt like a funny word to write. I added some other doodles, and then I kind of remembered that this was a DnD / RPG type of thing, so I wrote Nat 1 on the side. If you know, you know. Also, critical fail, DnD, roll for initiative. Just your average nerdy D&D things. I also added that same mud to the bottom of this by flicking the paintbrush. This is a reenactment because I forgot to film it. This looks even more like dirt when it dries. So that's how I made the dice jails. This is just a fun little thing for your Dungeons & Dragons table. This is something that you can create whether you're a dungeon master or a player. Let me know in the comments below which one you like the best. I think this one was much more successful than I thought. At first, it was like, this is the obvious one that everybody's gonna like. And that might be the case. But I started to get really bored with it after I started. In the end, though, I think the paint job really brought it to life, and I'm happy with how this one came out. The dumpster is probably my personal favorite. I do tend to like modern post-apocalyptic things, even though it's not the most Dungeons and Dragons-y one. But I do think that this one is just so like meme-esque and silly that it doesn't really matter that it's not a fantasy theme. I think a lot of DMs and players would really get a kick out of this one. And I personally just think it looks awesome. This one I feel like is a classic, can go with lots of different themes, and can also double as some scatter terrain. And lastly, this one I think was probably the least successful as a dice jail. I think it works a little bit better as scatter terrain. I mean, the dice just kind of sits in top. It's like, okay, cool. But as scatter terrain for any sort of industrial setting, this came out fantastic. I love the build. I just think it probably doesn't really make that much sense as a dice jail. And let me know if you'd ever want me to revisit this. I do have a few other ideas that I could whip up, and I think this is a really fun craft. Lastly, before the glamour shots, I just want to say one more time, thank you to everyone for watching and subscribing. At the time of recording this, I think I have 101 subscribers, which isn't anything crazy compared to established YouTube creators. But after just posting 2 videos, I'm really happy with that. I couldn't be happier. The fact that even just 101 people out there on the internet have chosen to subscribe to these videos is really cool to me. So continue to watch if you feel so inclined. Feel free to give it a like, subscribe if you haven't subscribed, comment down below with any thing you want to see from me next. I'm really proud of what I've created so far, and I can't wait to continue making more content. Without further ado, final review.